We're at the very beginning of our very long travel around the world. Every time we meet, we will explore a new region. Yet before we start our travel, it may be worth spending some time and properly packing our conceptual backpack. We need to make sure the terms and concepts needed are clearly understood. So this is what we'll do today. We'll explore some of the major words, concepts, terms needed. Let's start with maybe the keyword geography. Geo, the earth, graph, describe. So there are two approaches to the main goal of geography, description of the world. If you take a class in human geography, most likely your approach would be topical. You describe the world but from a topical point of view, such as cultural geography, economic geography, and most likely you would stay at a level of the world as a whole. In our case, approach is different. We stay at level of world as a whole only during the first lecture, and after that we will switch to a regional level. And our perspective, our description is from regional point of view, not topical, but individual areas of the world. So what is a region? A region is essentially a unit of Earth's surface imagined by the author of the textbook. It does not exist in the real world. It's arbitrary, based on certain criteria or properties. In this class, most of them are of cultural kind, plus some political and economic considerations. And we need regions to make our job of describing the world doable. There are too many places, too many landscapes. Instead of describing every single place, we will group them into some larger units, regions, and simplify or generalize. Other sciences do the same. Like if you take a class in history or geology or biology, you may observe that instead of describing every individual event, they group them into some larger units of temporal kind, like periods, or of some taxonomic kind, like in case of biologists. By the way, in our class, I will use this light gray scale coloring to indicate that a text or some material is secondary and not that important. It's just to explain something. Yet when colors become solid, like right now, maybe you need to start paying attention again. So very much like biologists, geologists, or historians, geographers generalize. And they use regions of different scale levels. Again, at the beginning of the course, we stay at global level during this first lecture. But then most of our discussions will be at level of world regions. For simplicity, I also use a synonymous label realm. World region and realm is the same. Within our regional discussions, we also may have references to something of a smaller scale, like sub-regional areas. On this map, you may notice Maghreb in north of Algeria. That's a sub-region within larger regional units. Middle East and North Africa we will discuss. We also may have references to something very local, like in the same region, developments in the West Bank. But again and again, our main level is level of so-called world regions or realms. So if you take another class with another professor with a different textbook, you may notice that regions may have different boundaries. Like look, for example, at the Caribbean. In our case, it's part of a larger larger region called Latin America and the Caribbean, while in a different textbook, it may be a separate unit. Or look at Central Asia. In our case, it's part of the Russian domain, while it also could be discussed in a different textbook as a region of its own. So these are our textbooks regions. And they are again decisions made by the authors. We will just respect these decisions. Yet the order of traveling is mine. I believe it's better to follow human evolution, its major stages. We all come out of Africa, sub-Saharan, area, and this is where our first explorations will happen. Then we switched to Middle East and North Africa, the area of agricultural revolution, then Europe, where the Industrial Revolution happened, and so forth. Before we start our travel, it's worth knowing how to indicate where we are. If you say, oh, I'm in front of a building, that's a so-called relative location, relative to something else, and it's not accurate enough. Absolute location is more precise. Let's follow logic how it works. There are two more or less fixed points, so-called poles, north and south. These are points of intersection of the axis of the Earth and the surface. Then, if we connect points equally distant between two poles, we will get the first needed line, the equator. Then, draw parallel lines to equator. These are lines of parallels. And angular distance between any parallel and the major parallel, the equator, is so-called latitude. It does not express in miles or kilometers. Instead, we use angles. Degrees, minutes, seconds, and so forth. Similar logic for another set of lines, meridians. These are lines connecting two poles. One of them is selected as a starting point, so-called the prime meridian. At the time when the system was established, London was very powerful, and therefore, perhaps, maybe for other reasons as well, the prime meridian goes through London, so-called Greenwich meridian. And we start counting other meridians from this prime meridian, east and west. So angular distance, again, not miles, not kilometers, but in degrees, minutes, and seconds, angular distance between the prime meridian and another meridian is longitude. A combination of latitude and longitude gives you absolute location. Again, pay attention. Parallels and meridians are lines. Latitude and longitude are not lines. They are distances between lines, between prime meridian and other meridian, and between the major equator parallel line and any other regular parallel. So if you still have questions, maybe double check text. In the end of the textbook, we have special discussion of cartography and location and so forth. Plus, maybe watch film accompanying this course on longitude and latitude. What else? Whenever we have a map, we need to know scale. What is a scale? Scale of a map is a ratio. This is keyword. Ratio between real and portrait distance. Distance on the map and the same distance in real world. And it could be expressed like this, or as a mathematical ratio. So once in a while we have pop quizzes. They are just to stimulate engagement with material and maybe review for tests. On test we will have two kinds of questions. First, true false. Questions of this kind. Second, multiple choice. Multiple choice is more about examples. True false is usually about definitions. So let's maybe make it easy first time. Question number one. The ratio of distance on a map to actual ground distance is known as that map's scale. True or false? Perhaps true, we just discussed this. Second question, world regions are natural creations recognizable in the landscape. Perhaps false, we discussed world regions as created units. They are not natural, they do not exist in the real world. They are product of our mind. Lastly, which of the following is not one of our world regions? Perhaps D. United States is a country and in itself part of another larger world region known as North America, together with Canada. So of these 5 choices, D is the best one. Okay, our next block of discussions is related to themes. Every chapter has 3 major themes. Perhaps it's natural that every chapter starts with environmental discussions, continues with history, and in the end makes reference to politics. So for environment and society, I'd like maybe to highlight the following 3 global concepts and processes. Let's start from far away. The Earth has an axial tilt, and as a result, solar radiation from the Sun does not reach all spots on the surface of the spherical Earth equally. So some areas get more, some areas get less of sunshine, and many areas of the world have seasons. Yet there is an area which is relatively lucky or not lucky, depends on the point of view, not to have seasonality. Equatorial area. This is where sun is more or less all the time equally present, and here we have one of major global patterns of precipitation, convectional precipitation. Use your imagination. Solar radiation reaches the surface, warms the air, and saturated with moist, the air goes up. With higher altitude, it cools and starts depositing moist content. So here in the equatorial area, against stereotypes, we have both highest amount of solar radiation and precipitation. Deserts are not here, they are elsewhere. They are north and south of this belt of the equator. Look at image provided, so these pointers indicate movement of the air masses. They continue their travel from the equatorial area north and south, yet they already deposited their moist content in the equatorial area in the form of rain and maybe moist and fog and so forth. They come to areas north and south of the equator empty-handed, and they have little to offer. This is where deserts are formed. There is, in addition to global, also a set of local patterns of precipitation. They change, modify existing larger patterns. Use your imagination. If we have a mountain range, it forces air masses to change directionality of their movement and maybe go up. And again, the same process with higher altitude, air masses cool and start depositing what they have, local precipitation on one side of a mountain range. And if air masses continue their travel on the other side of the mountain range, they may have little to offer. So there may be a condition called rain shadow, all precipitation on one side, while the other side gets nothing or little. Let's now differentiate between two labels which sound very similar but they are not the same. Weather. Weather is about short-term, day-to-day expressions of atmospheric processes such as temperature, wind, precipitation. Weather may be extreme because it's kind of individual situation day to day, while climate is more averaging of these situations, and as a result it's more predictable. It has patterns of certain kind. We may generalize about climate, and as geographers we care a lot about distribution of climate, so-called climate zones, areas with similar average climatic conditions. By the way, what I'm doing now, I am highlighting from textbook most important concepts. They're also explained there. Whenever you read text assigned, pay attention to terms in bold. Yet the first chapter is especially heavy loaded with terms. And whatever we discuss in this first lecture is most important. The rest could be taken a little bit later. Whenever we have double reference in the text and in lecture, that material is especially important. Pay attention and you will enjoy exams more. Okay, let's now maybe look at distribution of climatic zones. Logic is again very simple. Starting point is the equatorial area. This is where we have tropical wet climate for reasons discussed above, convectional precipitation. Then on two sides, north and south, we have belts of arid and semi-arid climates. This is where deserts and steppes are formed. Then, again, north and south of these two arid zones, we have mid-latitudinal continental climates. We will discuss them for Russia, for United States, Europe. These are climates with a clearer visible seasonality. If it's winter, it's winter. If it's summer, it's summer. And fall and the spring are both quite visible, unlike in many other areas. Lastly, extreme north and south of the world are taken by polar climates. And maybe let's also make reference to some local climates we will discuss in appropriate sections of this course. Mediterranean and monsoon climates, marine climates of Western Europe, all that will be discussed separately. These are more local, less global than what we just characterized here on this slide as climate zones. Let's now make connection between climate and landscapes they produce. When it comes to tropical wet climates of the equatorial areas of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the kind of typical landscape here is rainforest. Very deep, very rich, several levels of biological life. It's a result of, again, precipitation, which is present here all the time. As we mentioned, arid areas produce deserts, including the largest one, Sahara. Then in the mid-latitude areas, we have a typical landscape of forest, temperate forest, deciduous, coniferous, mixed, that kind of landscapes we see a lot in Canada, in Russia, Siberia, in northern sections of United States. And polar landscapes, polar climates produce landscapes of tundra and ice cap. As I mentioned, climate is more predictable and it has certain repetitive patterns, yet also overall, if we apply longer scale chronological time, we may observe some changes. Scholars believe that currently the trend is that climate has tendency to become warmer. It's a result of impact from human activities, emission of carbon dioxide, how it works. Let's look at this simple metaphor of greenhouse. It's similar to what happens to your car when it's parked on a sunny day outside. Basically, energy from the sun is able to penetrate the atmosphere. Yet then it radiated back from the surface a little bit transformed, and this transformed energy gets trapped in the atmosphere polluted by CO2. As a result, atmosphere overall becomes warmer. That's the idea how global warming works. So let's now look at another big concept of global scale Pangaea. At some point in the past, and we're talking about very, very distant past, millions of years ago, perhaps all now separate continents were one supercontinent called Pangaea. And this is our rendering, our imagination, how it may look like. Perhaps it's proven fact that Africa was core of this continent. We'll discuss this later. It doesn't have major mountain ranges. While areas which started moving in different directions do have them on predictable sides. Like if you look at Latin America and North America, what we have mountain ranges are along their western side. This is where greatest frictions are, because this is direction of movement of these continents. Australia, on the other hand, has its mountain ranges on eastern side, because that's the direction of its movement. For Eurasia, mountain ranges have a tendency to be more of a latitudinal kind, stretching from east to west or west to east, again because primarily the directionality of movement is to the north from Africa. Plate tectonics is a science which tries to summarize all these processes and provides a kind of summary picture. Now, let's maybe highlight some extremes. We will discuss them in appropriate sections of this class. Iceland, a country located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, is unusual in the following respect. It gets land, extra land every year, because it's located in the area where the two parts of oceanic Atlantic plate split and like conveyor belt add new land. This is how continents are moving apart. On the other side of the world, in Far East, East Asia, Japan is affected by an outcome of this process: oceanic Pacific plate colliding with Eurasian plate, producing seismic activities such as earthquakes. Quite often that results in tsunamis. We'll discuss this. Or look at this image from text showing result of collision of two continental plates, Eurasian and Indian, highest mountain range in the world, Himalayas. Further details are provided in the textbook how it works. Very remarkable process, indeed of a global kind. Overall, the greatest seismic activity is in the area around the Pacific, so-called Ring of Fire. California is part of this, and Japan too. Next block of themes in every chapter is about history, economy, and territory. Let's maybe highlight some major historical developments. Chapter starts with this kind of summary, a little bit too detailed. Let's maybe focus on major developments. I will keep you reminding a lot that we all come out of Africa, East Africa specifically, modern-day Kenya, Ethiopia. This is where we find earliest evidences of human species emergence, so-called hominids. And from this area, they started traveling around the world. Modern humans emerged in the same area, East Africa, and from the same area also started their travel around the world. Unfortunately, for the first species hominids, that resulted in their extinction. At the beginning of human history, we have genocide. Second wave exterminated, first wave hominids. These early people were hunting and gathering, migratory pastoralists. For them, the major breakthrough was discoveries they made in the area known as Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq and Israel, Egypt. This is the area where for the first time these early endlessly migrating people were able to stop, because they discovered how to domesticate animals and plants. That was a major breakthrough. Agriculture possible after that, settlements of different kinds from villages to cities, and eventually division of labor. The early migrants, hunting and gathering people, were just extended families doing the same job of looking for food, any food available. Hunting, fishing, there was no division of labor. When settlement happened, we see emergence of more complicated societies, with the state, with some people focusing on maybe knowledge-related activities like priests, or ruling others, military activities, so early division of labor. And eventually culture, religions also emerged out of this chain of events. Remarkable how many grand religions come out of this area: Christianity, Islam, Judaism. And eventually all this resulted in the emergence of first large-scale cultural systems known as civilizations in plural. Next major breakthrough was in Europe, the Industrial Revolution. It's indeed a major transformation based on so-called secondary activities we will discuss in a second, machinery, and utilization of new resources like iron and coal, production of steel, suddenly made periphery of the world, Europe, very, very important. Urbanization followed because these new activities made earlier employed activities early employment activities may be less efficient and redundant. Labor force had to look for new opportunities in cities or across the Atlantic. If you look at this map of spread of industrial revolution from United Kingdom, again the center of industrial revolution and the first really urbanized country in the world, it's almost like a map of United States ethnic geography in reverse. We see here earliest areas affected, Ireland and UK, and they are earliest source of migrants to United States. They settled in the area closest to Europe, middle and northeastern sections of United States, so-called New England. Next, this wave arrives to Germany and Scandinavia, and to make labor force redundant there, Germans and Scandinavians migrated and settled in the Midwest of United States. Then Industrial Revolution arrived to Italy, Eastern Europe, Poland, Jewish areas, and these migrants result again of becoming redundant in Europe. These migrants settled in the United States in urban places like Chicago, New York, because New England and Midwest was already taken by early migrants. Let's now summarize global history from economic point of view. There are changing sets of activities. At the beginning of history, when people were migrating endlessly, and then when they settled, their activity perhaps was of primary kind. It means that its first activity about extraction. Agriculture, mining, fishing, hunting, all these are examples of primary activities. Then, with Industrial Revolution, secondary activities arrived and became everything. If you look at the graph in the bottom right section of the slide, you see divergent fortunes of these two activities. Primary activities, blue line, declined. Secondary activity was on rise for some time, but then now it's also declining because in modern world other activities become more important. Tertiary means third after secondary. They are about exchange of what is produced of what is extracted. Examples are retail, services, distribution. And that's not the end of this list. Quaternary activities now become more and more visible. They are knowledge-based, and examples are like education, management, and their importance will be only increasing. So from primary to secondary to tertiary and quaternary, this is general directionality of change. And this is very ambitious summary of global history. Who knows, when I teach this class a million years from now, maybe we will have some other activities added. So the Industrial Revolution had enormous impact on life of people. Again, England became urban society. For the first time in history, we have more than half a population living in cities. It also had impact on political geography and geopolitics. Empires existed before the Industrial Revolution, and we may find many examples in the Mediterranean European area. Yet it was Industrial Revolution that made some of these European countries especially powerful. The British Empire was perhaps the biggest empire created ever, stretching around the world in major vital areas, having colonies. It's a product of the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, other industrialized countries also continued building their empires, and imperialisms of Europeans started producing tensions in Europe itself. First and Second World War could be treated as wars between imperial powers in Europe itself. When the Second World War was over, Europe remained divided during so-called Cold War. Two ideologies of capitalism and communism kept Europeans apart. Not only Europeans, the whole world was divided. Yet some nations remained non-aligned. Maybe use this slide to clarify what is Iron Curtain. It's a system of divisions within Europe, sometimes legal, sometimes material fences, all sorts of barriers preventing the two parts of Europe from interaction. You cannot travel during Cold War easily from east to west or back way. Supposedly globalization unites the whole world. It's about increased interconnectedness at different levels of economic activities, political, cultural, and so forth. Yet it not only unites, it also disunites, and criticism of globalization is quite significant. Is it good or bad? A big philosophical question. Maybe in the end of this course we'll be able to answer this question. Lastly, every chapter makes reference to culture and politics. Here we need to maybe to clarify some statistical terms related to demography. First, how many people are in the world right now? Maybe I need to update this slide. 7+ billion people in the world. It's enormous amounts of people. We're talking again not about millions, but billions. Let's maybe look at some examples of the difference. If you lived 1 million seconds, it's 11 days. Yet to live 1 billion seconds, you need to be at age 31. That's the difference. You see, maybe another example from a Concorde supersonic flight jet. Billion and million, not the same. So we already have 7 billion and the number keep growing. Let's maybe generalize about distribution of people. Humans have tendency to reside in lowland and coastal areas, not mountains, for obvious reasons, convenience and agriculture. Most of the people are north of the equator, maybe because this is where more land is available if you look at north and south hemispheres, especially in mid-latitudes of northern hemisphere. This is where greatest clusters of population are. Population is not distributed evenly. Look at East Asia, look at South Asia, Europe, clearly clusters are visible, while some other areas in the same regions are not well populated. Lastly, majority of people are from developing world, and that proportion will only increase because, as you will see in this course, more developed areas have lower fertility. So what are most populous countries right now? Perhaps you know that country number 1 by population is China. More than 1 billion people. India is also more than 1 billion people, and it's growing faster than China. So in our lifetime, China will be surpassed by India. What is number 3 country? By the way, all these countries in red color on this slide, they may be on test. You need to know the order. China number 1, India number 2, number 3, United States. It's more difficult to predict what is number 4. Not Russia, Indonesia, yeah, number 5, Brazil. So where is Russia? Quite far down in this list. It's largest by territory, but not by population. And like some other European countries, it's losing population. So it will perhaps keep going down this list. Population measures. We need maybe to compare countries. Some are more, some less densely settled. The easiest way to compare is to use so-called average arithmetic crude density. It's just number of people divided by total area. Yet areas are not the same. Some countries have more convenient lands, some have uninhabited lands. If we subtract uninhabited land and only use arable, cultivated land, we would get more accurate measurement called physiological density. Again, in a grayscale, something just kind of for explanation. For Australia, where a large section is not populated, the difference between two densities is quite visible. But for Bangladesh, where we have relatively small territory and densely settled, the difference between these two measurements is not significant. Population growth. We need to understand how to compare countries' dynamics. Birth rate is an annual number of live births per 1,000 population. Death rate is a similar logic, annual number of deaths per 1,000 population. Difference between them is so-called rate of natural increase. because birth and death are only two natural causes of change. Migration is not. So natural increase means only birth rate and death rate are taken into account. Migration is a movement from somewhere to somewhere, and when it comes to international migration, we may use special labels, immigration and emigration. It's about departure and arrival. The same person is both immigrant and emigrant, depends on statistics. If you decide to move to Russia, you are emigrant from American point of view, while in Russia you are an immigrant. So the same movement is in and out migration, just depends on point of view. Receiving country and country of departure would treat you either as immigrant or emigrant. This is another very ambitious summary of global history, this time from demographic point of view. Scholars believe that there is a major transformation that affects every society. At the beginning of history, for very long time, all societies had high birth rate and high death rate. They were very close to each other, and as a result, population was not growing at all. Then, Industrial Revolution transformed societies. Better life, better sanitation, food available, medicine, all this resulted in decline of death rates. Well, birth rate remains high for some time. People are very conservative. So this gap between death and birth rates results in population explosion. All societies went through this transformation. All societies had population explosion. Then comes next stage when birth rates begin to decline. So the gap between birth and death rate is reducing, and then eventually at stage 4 becomes the same. Birth and death rate are low, and there is no difference between them, so little growth. Textbook is making now reference to perhaps phase 5, where death rate becomes higher than birth rate. That's the case in Russia, Italy, Germany. It's a result of people living longer. That's how death rate becomes higher. And better lifestyle allows birth rate to be minimal. And also people are very consumerist. They don't have big families, so birth rate is not significant. For replacement, we need to have per family 2.1 children, otherwise society is not growing or declining. Anyway, belief is that all societies, all countries, all regions go through this transition from high birth rate, death rate to low levels. And when all regions complete this transition, global population will become again stable. So right now there is no region remaining in stage 1. Africa is behind others, it's at stage 2. Latin America and Asia already mostly in stage 3. Europe, Russia, Japan maybe at phase 4, 5. So all regions are at different stage of this transition. Let's now look at changes in global population. At time of Jesus Christ, again, grayscale, just kind of follow logic. At time of Jesus Christ, global population was maybe 250 million. It took about 16 centuries to double this, and 10 times less, a century and a half, to double to 1 billion. And look how little time it takes now, 40-something years, and population again doubles. Again, when all regions or most make the transition, then perhaps global population will again become stable and doubling time will increase again. We don't know exactly level, but maybe like 8 billion, 10 billion, and at that level population again will become stable, like at the beginning of history, because transition is over. For cultural discussions, religion and languages are very important. Let's look how we, geographers in this class, discuss languages. There are individual languages, but there are too many of them. We again need to generalize and simplify. For that, we group them into families. If you look at this map, it's erroneously labeled in the legend world's indigenous languages. Reality, it's a map of linguistic families. So in light green, we have Indo-European family. That's not a language, it's a family of languages, which in our discussion of Europe will be divided into subfamilies, because for Europe these subdivisions are meaningful. And only after that comes level of individual language. We almost never discuss them in this class because, again, there are too many of them. Next level is dialects. No, that's too picky a topic. So let's maybe use example of English, an individual language. It has dialects like British dialect and so forth. It's part of German subfamily of Indo-European family. Religions. We maybe need to see trend. At the beginning of history, all societies had traditional religions. They were of pagan, animist kind because they worshipped a lot Mother Nature, animals, mountains, and so forth. They had many gods, therefore they were polytheistic. Then these pagan religions were replaced by grand religions, perhaps of two kinds. One is a set of universalizing grand religions, such as Christianity and Islam, because they have missionary activities, they look for converts. We also have grand ethnic religions. They do not seek converts. Judaism is limited to primarily Jewish people. And lastly, the process is not over. In some areas of the world, we observe secularization trends, decline of religiosity. We'll discuss this for Europe. At the beginning, they had pagan religions, then became Christian, one of these grand religions. Now, many areas of Europe, especially in Scandinavia, are atheistic. People lost their religiosity. So that's kind of basic logic of development in the field of global religions. We will discuss them in appropriate sections of this course. Now let's maybe clarify some political geographical terms. Nation and state quite often in America used interchangeably, yet these are different terms. When we speak about politically organized territory and with sovereign governments recognized by other states, with population and economy, it's what? Nation or state? State. Nation is not about territory. State may have no population at all, yet nation shall be large. It's a large group of people, and they share culture, history, they have a sense of homeland, and unlike states, recognition comes from within. People themselves believe they are one whole, they are one ethnic group. Then it's a nation. Nation may or may not have its own state. The best example of nation without state is Kurds. Large group of people, clearly nation, yet they don't have their own states. They are between several states like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey. Nation state with dash is a situation when there is close match between these two, when every state has one nation. Japan may be a good example of that, because most of Japanese are on the island state of Japan, and the state doesn't have many minorities. They do have like some Koreans, but relatively speaking, it's one of the most homogeneous countries. So here we have close match between people, nation, and territory, state. That's why Japan is a good example of the nation state. The result of confusion between these two labels, state and nation, is perhaps erroneously named organization, the United Nations, because nations are not members of United Nations. Kurds, nation without state, is not member of United Nations because members of United Nations are states. So a small tiny state somewhere in the middle of ocean is member of United Nations because it's a state, even if maybe with few residents, while Kurds, large ethnic group, nation, is not. So proper name for United Nations is United States, yet this label is already taken by one of the states, United States of America. No, anyway, this somewhat confusing use of these terms. Maybe a better name for United Nations would be United Countries, because again, not nations but states, countries are members of United Nations. Lastly, let's maybe make reference to dynamic nature of states. They have rights, they're recognized by others, but in some areas of the world we observe trend to share these trends towards supranationalism. Maybe the best example of that is European Union. This is where states, individual states, give up some of their privileges and act together in a union called European Union. The point was to prevent another war from happening in Europe, to make Europeans more interdependent, and that's example of supranationalism, basically sharing at level above national level of some rights, such as foreign policy, agricultural policy, and so forth. NAFTA, a trade bloc between three countries of North America, is another example of supranationalism. That's it for today.